thank you so much for your introduction, Yelena. It's lovely to be with such a esteemed group of colleagues and students. I see many familiar faces. I'm happy to be with you today. What I wanted to do today is not particularly delve into a very intense research talk, but possibly, I guess, tell you a story of how I have digressed away from it, if that's could be the start of my talk. I have a few slides which I would like to show. So as I've pointed out, I am going to talk a little bit about something which I'm actually not focusing on as a researcher. My presentation today is titled Hunger as a Marker of Normal Life. A bit of a controversial, I suppose, combination of words, but I do argue in my book on which I'm currently working on, and I am looking into particularly this trope of hunger as part of a bigger discussion of rural narratives. As I say, I've noticed in my interviews I'm going to discuss with you today that this combination has all the reasons to be present in people's stories when they reflect on their lives. I have started thinking of talking about hunger, more specifically because we are in the month of November. Typically, Ukrainian Canadians, Ukrainians around the world, and many other people around the world recognize this month as a month of commemoration of the victims who had died in the hunger in Holodomor in 1932, 1933. This is, of course, a well-known tragedy these days. It has been on the radar, so to speak, of the scholars, of community members for the last 30 or so years since Ukraine's independence. But I'm not a researcher of Holodomor as much as others are. But with my other work, with my other projects I've been part of, I have been exposed to very intense stories of the experiences of hunger, which have brought me vicariously through those stories into the times of 1946 and 1947. And it is a time of another famine in Ukraine and in the former USSR. During that particular period of time, up to 1 million people have perished in Ukraine only. And like the Holodomor in the 30s, this particular famine has been understood as orchestrated, engineered by the socialist regime in the Soviet Union, coupled also, of course, with the privations of the post-World War II reconstructive period. I'm not delving into the details of why it had happened. Rather, I'm going to be revisiting today with you the stories which numerous villages have shared with myself and others who were involved in a large-scale project I have conducted some time ago in Ukraine. I have worked on this project for quite a while, and many of you have heard me discussing it in different ways. And that's what I'm saying, that today I'm not talking about my book or about my research on this particular topic as how collective farming fell apart. Rather, because I was exposed to so many life histories, to so many personal autobiographies, oral autobiographies, I'm compelled by my so-called data to actually approach the stories differently. And heading into November, I thought, okay, I will give it a bit more of a special discussion. And I had this wonderful opportunity. Thank you for inviting me into the Folklore Lunch. My original project, Oral History of Decollectivization, of course, the title itself speaks about my very first interest in this, in the collapse of the collective farming in Ukraine. But because oral history as a method relies on intense, in-depth autobiographical interviewing, in the end, interestingly enough, what have come out of this research that most of attention people have paid in their stories when they spoke of themselves to their lives overall, to their lives in their childhood, again, back in 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, basically to their Soviet lives, before their lives were taken away from them. I would say their lives in the collective farming system, or their lives as realized agriculturalists of a very powerful Soviet state at a time as it's seen like that. So these lives were taken away with decollectivization. So thus, I am revisiting the life stories altogether. And when I've started working and plowing through thousands and thousands of pages of transcripts and eventually listening to the interviews as well, because you have to do that, I have come upon, of course, numerous strategies, so-called narrative strategies of self-positionality, self-representation that villages have relied on. And today, again, I don't have time to discuss in depth, very complex and layered picture of what villages used as these narrative strategies. Rather, I want to focus on one and only kind of a strategy. I call it a wording strategy. So having looked at those life stories, the initial attention was paid by me as an oral historian to the life story presentation, to how the stories were pitched, how they were positioned, what kind of life individuals wanted the researchers to accept as the legitimate representation of who they are, what narrative tools they relied on when they were telling their lives. And ultimately, my final goal or large meta goal was to contextualize these stories to find out whether we are talking about some particular meta narrative of a particular generation which has come out of age in post-World War II, which has not been subject to famines in 1933, and has been fully socialized in the collective farming system. As well as I was very interested in finding out, well, not interested, but I'm asking this question, whether their story would ever be actually preserved and told in the contemporary political context of Ukraine, which makes Ukrainians as a nation, as policy makers, focus on very different narratives from the recent Soviet past in their ongoing memory battles and memory fights, so to speak, historical memory fights. So the project has gathered 170 stories in these numbers of villages. The villages were all chosen to be born in a particular time frame, just to have some coherency in what stories would be told. So as I said, today I'm going to focus on just wording strategies, as there are so many others which I'm discussing elsewhere. And what I wanted to mention to myself and to you as well, that when I work with oral histories, I don't work with just detached narratives as such. I look at the interviews in whole as storytelling events. And I recognize, because I've been doing this work so many years, as well as so many of you have been interviewing people, you understand what I'm talking about, that anytime a message is generated by our respondents, it has something to do with the audience. It has something to do with the context. It has something to do with questions in the way they were pitched. So there are complex storytelling events embedded in the momentum of when the interview is taking place. More specifically, for today, I'd like to again revisit this question: what wording strategies villages relied on to simultaneously accomplish quite a few tasks. It is not an easy one: to recollect, to remember what they have lived through, to relate it, to tell it, to package it into particular coherent narrative or so, but also importantly is to translate their experiences, their life experiences, to a very different generation than their own, to post-Soviet youth who actually had very little understanding what was collective life would be like. So in this particular context, at some point I had a sabbatical, and I had this privileged time frame of just sitting in my data, so to speak, in my interviews. And for today's discussion, I'm limiting my conversation to about 120 interviews only, because they're more representational of the entire palette of 11 oblasts I'm discussing. And what is for us, the researchers, to dive into narratives. Of course, we have so many ways of unpacking or finding out what is going on, what kind of structures are used in composition, in a trajectory arc, what sort of dynamic is surrounding when it comes down to the protagonist, antagonist, and whatnot. There's so much, right, goes on in each and every story. Same goes on in life story narratives as recorded by our project. But what is probably most easiest to access, if you have all the transcripts, 1,000 pages of this in front of you, is the words, the key metaphors, the tropes. And that's what I've started with. So I started, having read through all the interviews, I actually have been quite, not puzzled, but I've been reminded of so many commonsensical observations I've had myself as a researcher, but also as heard others saying that there's much repetition in how rural folks relate what they lived through. So I wanted to see what is being repeated. And luckily, of course, once we have electronic data, we can quantify a little bit of this material, not much. So one of the most powerful tropes which villagers used was, of course, the one probably many knows, "Голодні та холодні," in English, cold and hungry. The word holod, or the stem holod, is being related in interviews about 319 times, according to my transcripts. Holod is a little bit less than that. Eventually, you could probably imagine the next common phrase that people might need to go to relate their experiences and translate it would be "голі й босі," naked and barefoot, slightly fewer counts there. The word "біда" will be coming up a lot, but not as much as "голод" and "холод," "голодні" and "холодні." And interestingly, though, the word "нормально," "нормально," as if in those expressions life was normal, everything was in order, everything was just fine, also has been a very, very common word. And I'd like you to pay attention to this again, somewhat of a controversial and maybe contradictory nature of these very tropes. One is pointing out to privations and the other one is pointing out to very different kind of life experiences. Equally, many references were made to the past, how when joy was lived through and experienced. But going further with my word counts or with my efforts to find most common phrases which villages relied on to relate the experiences, interestingly, bread would come up far more times. And it's again a separate discussion, not enough time for us today. And there are, of course, good reasons why. In addition to these particular words which are on the surface of our data when it comes to narrative, they are, of course, for me, were triggers, because they've dictated to me the need to go a little bit further and to see and seek the reasons why they were coming up as often as they have been. Apart from historical reasons, apart from the necessity to recollect what was going on in the past, famine included, villages faced very different generation of Ukrainians. I would just relate to one little incident that even the granddaughter, one of my respondents, had no idea what was kolkhoz, and she was in a room and listening to an interview between herself and the researcher. So there's a huge distance, cultural distance between generations there. But because I'm saying we need to, or at least because I'm saying I value and we should be valuing interviews as storytelling events, I invite you to listen to some of these stories, which are, of course, another tool which villages utilized to relate most meaningful experiences. And again, I argue elsewhere how we have a strong correlation between most impactful experiences a human person goes through and the necessity to relate it through the tool, through the means of actual storytelling. And rural folks, the way they have been immersed in their immediate environment, in their physicality of it, they're also dialogic in how they are speaking during the interviews, very different from Western-based interviews, as you know, how many interruptions could happen. And this dialogic mode of interviewing, or rather mode of conversation during the interview, also is a telling point of how they prefer to narrate their experiences. There's an idea of validating of their claims by others, but there's also this invitation to immerse yourself in the story. Okay, let's maybe listen to some of those, and let's hopefully this will do. Stories of 1947.
Батько у тракторні робив, батько ще хвилював, а в тракторні робив помощником, так там то баланди зварять якоїсь, а такий кусочки 2 хліба принесеться, на пайок давали, це нам з братом принесеться, ми тільки хліба бачили. А тоді вже ходили, то і валики ті рвали у траві, клевер, да, цього, щавель кінський, і то терли. А тоді вже після того колоски збирали. Це як не проженуть, да не наб'ють там, так колоски збирали. Хто був тягли в хату, то вклеїть, щоб це куті зварити, вона пахне мені й досі. Камінь такий лежав, отакий завбишки на полу, і воно в мене камінець і досі є на пам'ять, на курки, отакий обточений, камінцем терли. А тоді ж ото у шелуху дав. А тоді макуха появилася, ну як ще із насіння це добре, як уже із тієї, з бавовни, ой, не добре, ой. А тоді ото кользу почали сіяти якось, а тоді почали їздити у Западну по хліб.
I should have perhaps started with the bit of a bridge between my general view of wording strategies used in the interview before jumping in the stories of 1947. But since we're already there, maybe let me briefly point out that because our interviewers, or rather respondents or project participants were of particular generation, they've arrived in 1947 as very young individuals. And some cases that were a couple of years old and their stories would be retellings of other people's experiences, but in some as well that the stories were their own. And in concrete, specific, in immersive stories as these ones, we get, of course, exposed further to instances and kinds of food which people have eaten. And that's what we're trying to get out of those stories as well. Let me just go on with the next.
Вот как раз 47-й год был голод, вот, и да и 48-й тоже. И я вот ночью, я такой был рослый, вот, и ночью встаю, где-то в 5 часов мне мать поднимает, а отец сделал такую, как стол, это крутилка такая, 2 камня, камень по камню, там сколько зерна было сыпется, мы с матерью крутим ее, мука, и потом добавляем, и там толкли в ступах или так руками его, это как перекати поле, трава такая, как курай мы называем. Добавляли туда, потом папороть эту сухую туда, и это все вместе мололи. Хлеб пекли, так сказать, не хлеб, а такие малаи, лепешки такие вот так пекли. Ну, вот этим обходились.
Timofey Zhorin speaks from Izmail region in Odessa Oblast, one of the hard-hit oblasts in the famine of 1946 and 47, and especially in this area because there was just, if this particular region was just recently annexed to Soviet Ukraine, and therefore the collectivization was just concluded or was still happening in some particular context. But not only Western Ukrainian newly annexed territories were subject to experiences, but other parts of Ukraine, Central and Eastern as well. Well, I guess we have another story from...
Голод, и топить не было чем, то камышом топили, то соломой. Мама все время пекла Коля! 2 раза в неделю мама пекла хлеб для всех на соломе. Соломой, потому что ничего не было так.
А что еще кушали?
Ну, мама легу кушали, когда был голод, вообще-то стебли от кукурузы вот чистим и молотим и делаем с них, как муку и мама делала, мама лег. Борщ мама лега, картошка. Еще она все время нам варила пшеницу и кукурузу, варила, в печку ставила, даже казан. Кушали как поросята. Ну, один умер, наш брат, во время голодовки умер. А дети как умирали? Под забор. Под забор вот приходят, просят. И тут пухнет вот такой живот. Я помню, как сегодня, что возле нашего двора умер мальчик.
Это какой год? Когда?
Это был в 47-м. 46-й, самый большой, это был, засуха была большая, ничего не родила. 46-й уже началось вообще Ничего не было. А в 48-м уже был хлеб хороший.
Many respondents also focused on actual recipes of survivors. In some ways, these stories we have looked at could be called recipes. Some have taken joy or not, but we're interested in actually explaining how that simplest of simplest foods was made. And some interesting aspects, or many amongst many others, is the number of compensatory strategies the narrators were using when telling those oftentimes horrific accounts of what they went through. Oral historians oftentimes comment on how in cases when relating experience of Holocaust or Holodomor or in famine 47 in this particular case, people choose to laugh as not to laugh it off, but as a defensive, safe means of
Вы такие, что в 47 году, помню, сажали картошку. Сажали картошку, ну, знаете, трудности были, да. И на второй день можно увидеть, ничего нет, никакой картошки.
Копали.
Ночь искали.
Выкапывали следом, да?
Понимаете, от чего было, значит. Потом весной, когда вышли, и суслики, и что только нет, понимаете. Ловили, жарили. А потом были и случаи, когда вот так только появилась слобода, какая-то крапива или что-то, вот так вдоль дороги. Пасли люди, как пасут скот, понимаете, вот как ягнята пасутся, понимаете, это на травинке. Вот люди. И только поднимается немножко, делает пару шагов, и с него течет вот так жижа, понимаете. И страшное дело.
And let's listen to this one.
Казала мати їжаків у печі на топе, тоді накидають тоді їжаків хлопці. Назбирають, воно ті голки пообгоряли, тоді шкуру то зніма і доїли. Пекли то з бур'янів, з усякого там щавілі, листя та то клипекло, мати оладки жовті. І було дощ, поскільки там по 2 чи по 3, а та заховав, бо боялася, що понаїдаємось та помремо. Не того, що їй шкода була, що ми помремо. Та оцей брат, що це, тут він у Полтаві живе, так значить, як поліже на ту піч, туди на кумін, та й достав ту миску там, то всі поїв, а мати каже, мені їх не шкода, я й ще напечу. Так шкода, що ти ж захворієш, умреш. А так і Бог милував.
And there are many more countless stories which we cannot be part of given the time constraints we have today. But I'd like to again to reiterate that when we work with audio materials, we have a very different way of entering what we typically call data or narrative plane of our interviews, because we get exposed to so many other things. So when I was working towards this presentation, I've mentioned that I was a little bit excited about some quantification of the material. And of course, you get interested in seeing what sort of, references, so-called food references might be there altogether when it comes down to looking back at that particular childhood of that generation, which eventually grew to become very proud Soviet farmers. And this particular list represents some of those references and maybe not the best translation of the original and dialectic words which were used to discuss those. There's one particular word here, you can easily find it very quickly in the first column, which really makes me uneasy when it comes down to using the word food references in famine. And I wish maybe you can suggest me a different way of framing that. So I would perhaps you choose a different way of saying food references when it comes down to this meager diet and choices people had. There's more conversations on the diet, and we don't have time to discuss that. In my particular case, I am bringing up those, so to speak, wording strategies, or in particular references to what has been eaten, and discussed in those stories, which were also the narrative tools I briefly am pointing out to today. 1947 was 46, the famine of 1947, 46, 97, was just a period in overall people's lives who we've interviewed for the project. And to understand these individuals who were decollectivized in the 90s, by the end of 2000, by the end of the 20th century, it's important, of course, to know what are the formative experiences of their youth? What were those formative experiences? And 1947 has come to surface time and again through all the interviews, whether people have lived themselves and experienced that, or they've been referencing their neighboring villages or neighboring families, and so on and so forth. But this is a time when people come of age, when certain tropes perhaps and experiences become formative, not just simply for the life of a person, but also for the life stories of an individual. And of course, let's not forget the historical context. The collective farming system has been one interesting, sorry, pardon my word, one complex experiment. I can laugh it off with the word interesting, it's just inappropriate. Large complex experiment of collective economic input in the agricultural sector of the former Soviet Union, with many, many experimentations which were taking place later in the 50s, in the 60s, and only in 70s and 80s, the informants and respondents of ours have been referring to the 70s and 80s as the time of relative stability, and to a point that actually those were very memorative times in which they have realized themselves as successful Soviet, but still farmers. So tropes of privation, the words of hungry and cold and hungry, for example, holodny, or simply holod, or a reference to hunger as such, would surface up here and now throughout the discussion of the entire lives of the individual, sometimes to specific experiences. Some people referred to the Khrushchev experimentations with kukurudza, corn, as times of holodivka, as times of famine again, and some have operated without imposition on behalf of the researchers with this terminology themselves when discussed the mid-50s, and their own experiences. The 90s, with the collapse of the agricultural system in Ukraine, had again unleashed this, the presence of these stories and wording strategies in the context of people's reminiscences of their post-Soviet lives. Thus, altogether, the word hunger and hungry emerges not so much as just reference to someone's youth, but also as a framing tool, narrative framing tool of the entire life stories. And there are quite a few ways of how those are used, and I'm just bringing up a few. You know, if you take expressions like that, these were not hungry years, or these were hungry years, this works as an evaluative tool, but also as a value ascribing tool, especially in the context when villages would talk about their lives, that lives were good, lives were normal, we were not hungry. So these are the way that stories were framed was in the context of that reference. And ultimately, coming back to the title of my today's talk, you know, hunger is a marker of normal life. Is there such a thing? Can it be a marker of normal life? Yes, in the context of narrative representations of lived experience, especially in the context of that last phrase I've just referred to, life was good, we were not hungry. So the word hunger and hunger is used to point out to the normalcy of the people's lives. Removing myself away from the particular context of hunger 1947, wording strategies, focusing on tropes of privation, and looking back at how the overall life stories were composed and produced and narrated by the villagers, I am reminded yet again of certain multi-layeredness in how life stories of former last generation of collective farming villages were produced. Yes, there were accounts of privation, and that's where the introductions to these experiences were. That's what we've listened to with you today. But these were the times of the youth. These were the times people were coming of age and life was still ahead and life had to be lived. And to be a successful human being, we need to assure ourselves that our lives are also successful. Therefore, going forward through these very difficult Soviet years of collective farming, our villages, this particular generation, worked narratively speaking to normalize their experiences for their youth audiences who were interviewing them. So we found many words of normalna and normalization of these sort of efforts at normalizing their otherwise very difficult experiences in the village. This is done, of course, with the purpose of finding and restoring meaning in individuals' lives. But moving on into the 90s and understanding our villages were interviewed at a time when their life worlds collapsed, they've also engaged in the project of romanticization, looking back at their Soviet lives, perhaps more specifically into their normal lives of 1970s and 80s. And also restore, not only thinking of them as normal good lives, but also as good lives, as lives accomplished lives. What I referred to here again is the effort to romanticization of the personal past also happens to be, it coincided with the romanticization of the Soviet past. It just has been the this congruence between a generational trajectory of these individuals and the histories unfolding throughout this post-World War II Soviet Union times. And again, this is a very needed effort on behalf of narrators of their personal lives to validate their lives, to see them as positive in the end, no matter what. So in some ways, to wrap it up and have us maybe a discussion here, hunger and normalcy do come together in narratives in a very complex and layered ways. There are key tropes of those villagers' lives who have lived through a lot, who have gone through various periods, and who nonetheless want to come across in their life stories as successful human beings, as accomplished individuals. They just don't want to be victims all the time, though it's very layered, and we can talk more about that later. Well, thank you very much. I also want to thank a few folks who have been involved with this project here and there for cleaning up data and helping me with processing it. And yeah, I'll be happy to talk more about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. And now the floor is open for questions. Before starting it, I would like to apologize. I will disappear soon because I have a class to teach. And I would ask Marina to pick up the discussion and continue conducting the discussion when I'm away. So please, I have to admit, it is really close to home. I think many of us remember our grandmothers and our grandfathers' stories. You know, basically, it's amazing how, you know, closeted in, you know, even in wording recipes, how to survive. So thank you very much. And please, anybody wants to start with questions, comments? Yeah, Alexander, please.
Daria, thank you for really interesting presentation. It actually relates to my own research in southern Ukraine, and especially when you speak about villagers, because right now I'm working on historical conscious of villagers in southern Ukraine. And my question will be about actually connections in your stories. Actually about the role the stories of Holodomor of 1932-33 played on narrating strategies of describing the experience of Holodomor of 1947. So because you described that they described this as a joy or something like this, maybe their parents played a huge role in actually making this narrative stand out. So thank you.
Thank you. This is a very loaded and very good question. We cannot take personal narratives outside of the historical and ideological context in which the interviews were recorded. This is where the complexity emerges. given the educational background or personal narrative abilities or personal experiences, some individuals may borrow heavily from, say, public discourse, which again is broken down from the meta public discourse of the nation to regional ones to newspapers circulating in the district itself and so on and so forth. But so there's this impact as well. There are references to 1932 and 1933 because these families and these individuals are direct descendants of those who have survived for the most of it. I don't remember an interview in which hunger or a reference to Holodivki or Holodomor were not made. All of them have referenced that. But what is interesting altogether for me is that perhaps because we're talking about the villages who were on the ground and are quite immersed in their own local life world, and somewhat disengaged with circulating agendas of local elite or maybe public. I mean, they are engaged, but when it comes down to translating their own personal lives, that is switched off, and the effort to explain oneself is coming to the surface. So I'd like to think that what we were shared, based on what I've read through all the transcripts, is mostly informed by local personal experiences and generational memory within the family. And it's also very easy to see where a person borrows labels or categories from the discourse. For example, Holodomor as such is an example of how people would operate with that. But the most people would say Holod, just simply famine, or Holod, hunger. That's the way we would operate. So I'll stop there. Thank you for your question.
Other questions, please? Yes, Bogdan, please.
Yeah, Bogdan Trid here. Natalia, did you record any chastushke from the villagers? The short folk songs about the famine?
There were some were pointing out that they were there, but no one had recited them, unfortunately. Okay. Unfortunately not, yeah, in our case. I think they exist somewhere in the internet world, but they're disconnected typically, right? We don't have the bibliographical data to accompany those chastushki to place them in a context, but yeah. I haven't seen, I know that people have referenced them. There's some other points about the kolkhoz, but not those, not the famines.
Okay, and this is slightly a follow-up question. This is slightly off topic, but did the villagers also talk about grain collections or collections of food that were being taken for state, by state collectors for to meet food quotas?
Yeah, that has been brought up quite often. Maybe not in the most elaborate way, depending on an individual. Those people who have lived through collectivization in the West themselves, this is places us outside of the 1932-33, of course, but it strikes how the experiences were parallel. So those gave us vivid and very oftentimes very challenging vivid stories of hardship. Interestingly enough, Southern Ukrainians, I don't know why we were so lucky in the Odessa interviews, which of course is such a diverse region itself. There were such good, what I call genealogical memory present in many respondent stories, in which they were very able to account in detail for the experiences of their parents, and that were also stories of requisition brought up.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. And Andrei, please.
Hello, thank you. Bogdan said, did you collect? And I had the impression that I don't have a clear idea of the actual project from 2008 to 2010. Can you tell us a little bit about how it was organized? Who did the collecting, who did the interviewing, and where that material is now?
Right. Thank you, Andrei. As I said, I'm a bit jumping into the project I've spoken about before in some context. The project has been longitudinal. It took us 3 years or so to 2 years officially, and then we were catching up with some interviews during the 3rd year to go into 11 oblasts in Ukraine to join together with local oral history offices in these oblasts to design, collaborate, arrive at the project design, and then involve young researchers who were either graduating students doing oral history work, or in some cases there were young folks going towards their candidacy as well. So for the most of it, interviews were recorded by very young individuals who were born in the millennials, I would say. That's the experience. What is also very good about the setup of the project, Andriu, is that we made a point of making connections meaningful. So it was not about hop in and give me the story and I will go. So the relationships were built. Usually we've benefited from the pre-existing relationships through relatives, through family connections and whatnot. And there was a bit more of an ethnographic dimension to that oral history project, which is oral history projects typically don't go deeply into ethnography, but in this case, we've tried as much as we could. And we've originally the focus was on the complete challenging experiences of decollectivization, because we all understand with the collapse of the collective farming in Ukraine, people were squeezed out from their communities to work as labor migrants internally in Ukraine and the former Soviet Union and then abroad, and they've lost their livelihood. And the new land reform was delayed, and people were in a very desperate state. This particular generation, and of course their children already knew different life. So there was this element of translation, which I was pointing out, between those who have lived in, whose lives were built in the collective farming system, versus those millennials who were born afterwards and had very little understanding of what's going on. On top of it, Andrea, I'll wrap it up very quickly. The story of Kolhospis is not particularly a hot story. There's so much goes on right now in historical discussions in Ukraine. There's so much to reclaim from the Soviet history. There are much more dramatic stories of, the opposition in World War II, the collectivization after the World War II, the underground struggles in Western Ukraine, and there's lots going on. I mean, the Gulag story, and so on and so forth. Repressions were happening in the 70s again. There's a lot there. So this particular generation has sort of fallen off the radar altogether because they were sort of caught between the major cataclysms. They were not part of major cataclysm until decollectivization. So I hope that explains a little bit.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Anybody else? Any other questions? Matthias, please.
Oh.
Yeah, thank you so much for your fascinating presentation. I'm sorry because I was several minutes late, so maybe I missed something, but I'm wondering about what about the Great Patriotic War? Because did people make some connection between the hunger and the hardships of World War II? Yes. Or was it some I don't know, some means to explain what happened?
Yes, thank you, Matthias. Good to see you. Thanks for coming. When we're focusing in our presentations on one period or the other, we have so little time to give broader context. And I appreciate your question because, frankly, for these individuals, hunger did not begin with 1946 or 97. Oftentimes, if they're born in late 30s, as many were, they were starving. All of them were starving throughout the time of war as well. So in some ways, the idea of normalcy, if you wish, is all reiterated through simplest, silliest fact of repetition. So normal in this case is not the word which indicates the goodness of the experience, but rather of its dreading, repetitive normalcy. So yes, the war experiences were associated with privation very strongly by the kids. The only difference is that they are very young during the war. They're not yet full agents of their own lives. They have not yet entered the adulthood, or they're just very young. Their memories are different, but nonetheless there.
Thank you. And Marina, I will ask my question because I am leaving, and after that you are leading the discussion. So Natalia, thank you once again. A lot of memories of my grandmother and grandfather and our grandmother. I presume somehow, maybe I'm wrong, that there are different types of narratives. As you mentioned in the beginning, audience is a very important factor in the strategy. And it feels like by telling about hunger to an outsider and passing information inside of a family to a younger family member, where you mostly focus on how-to stories, not that much what happened stories. So it feels that it's different situations. So did you have a chance to kind of separate stories of those who lived through and those who heard stories from their parents and see if there are some significant differences?
Yes, thank you. This is a very good context again, which dictates the pitch, the message, and the framing of a story. There is a difference, of course, in how this is where I think this is where I've chosen to add the word immersive storytelling to differentiate it from a different kind of storytelling, which can be a recycled storytelling. Villages were very happy to share stories of privations, not happy to share, but they were able to share stories of privations from themselves of their own. And oftentimes these were not as elaborate or depends on an individual, but those which have come to them from elsewhere would be more polished just because they were already currency, local narrative currency in the community. And those would be rounded up. Usually it's actually very noticeable, very noticeable. Yeah. I wanted to add that working with these interviews and again, trying to reclaim the lives altogether of these individuals, that generation, makes me realize to what degree overall their reflexivity, their means of reflecting upon themselves differs from, say, the ways maybe my Western respondents would be able to do so. So I'm also discussing the discrepancy in oral historical narratives that way as well, how incomplete, how maybe chopped the narrative can be. And yet I'm trying to argue that we should not be discarding those stories which are hard to follow because they are just oscillatory, right? They're not straightforward. But it's not because of the narrative incompetence they are that way, just because they never had the chance to speak about those experiences. No one comes to them to speak about those experiences. So there's that too.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure who's hosting now.
Are there any other questions? Natalia, we can do it in a democratic way, I think. There was a request for a recording of the presentation, which will be made available at a later time. Joe has a question. Go ahead, Joe.
My question's a little bit more broad, I guess, just about this whole genre of childhood memory stories. I was just reading an account by a kid who survived the Vilnius ghetto. And that story, the memoir that he wrote later when he was 75 years old or something, was full of stories about food and how he got food and getting food. And I wonder, if you're talking about your childhood, if you're an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old, what other things do you have to think about or talk about? You don't have the context of the war, as Matthias asked about, or the politics. You're an 8-year-old. Your world is, I think, more around family. Is it that surprising, would be my question, that these childhood narratives focus on food?
Not at all. Not at all. And by zooming in on these stories, I'm not suggesting that we have a very unique oral historically speaking context, because this has been happening all the time. On top of it, I have had many interviews here in Western Canada with Ukrainian Canadians say with Ukrainian Canadian women activists and communities, their lives evolve around community cooking, and they have been talking of food as means of, again, advancing their sense of identity as community leaders, but talking about food. Very Ukrainian Canadian same in a way too. But coming back to the point of childhood and food memories, especially in the context of privation, there's absolutely, this becomes well, it's a horrible word, but a key word, a trope, which just defines your experience. But what is interestingly, in the context, I'm sure, with that individual who you're referring to, I wonder, actually, I'm not sure, whether throughout his memoir, there would be a recurrent presence of that mind frame, of food, of lack of food. And what I'm trying to do with these stories in my context is to see whether there are some actually differences, how maybe memories of privation, when accessed after the collapse of totalitarian regime, might differ from memories of privation recorded with individuals who have not been subject to totalitarian or otherwise some sort of repressive regimes throughout their entire lives. So that's what I'm interested in conceptually. And I do see, and I'm finding some differences, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right to put it into the broader life context. I was just thinking about so many of the anecdotes that the people were talking about were from that particular phase, but you probably took those out of the bigger narrative of the life. And the story that I was just reading, he doesn't spend too much time on the later part of his life because it's just a happy ending story. He survived, he got food, he was rescued, he came to Canada and lived happily ever after, right? So it's just a moment in his life that he spends a lot of time discussing details about how they got the bread, where they, what they did for it, or the detailed narrative. It's much more detailed in that section of his life than in other parts of his life, which fit into just a kind of more basic, happy trajectory or something.
Archetypal for all historical narratives. That's universal, that part. Yeah, thank you.
Natalia, we have a question from Kathleen. She's asking if your project has been published in any form, and is there a possibility to listen to more stories similar to what we heard today?
Thank you, Kathleen. There are a few articles which have been published in Ukrainian and English, and there's some book chapters on that. I am working right now, since I had this wonderful opportunity to join the Folklore Center as a Husulak chair. I'm looking forward to creating an online portal and putting stories up there eventually. But so far, they're available they're not available in public domain, but can be made available if some researchers have interest in them. Thank you.